I'm Dustin Hoffmann of the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, and this is Brazil. Come along with me on this series as I tour some of the agricultural areas of Brazil, from Minas Gerais and Brasilia to Mato Grosso and Rio de Janeiro. I will show you the farms, industries, and the people that have forged Brazil into a large player in the global ag marketplace. I'm coming to you today from the state of Mato Grosso. That is, of course, the state that we think of the most when we talk about ag production and soybean production in the country. But it's also stereotypically what Americans tend to want to think about, or others tend to think about when they think about Brazil. You look at the wood piles right behind me. A lot of people like to think that that's what Brazil agriculture is about. Destroying forests and putting in cropland, regardless of what it means to the people around the globe and what it means for the environment. While right now, yes, we are standing in a field that is being cleared out of forest, that is just further from the truth as to what is happening, as we have found here going through the country. There's a lot of conservation going on. There is a lot of environmental responsibility going on. Brazil is so much more agriculturally than trees that have been pushed down. The one thing you need to understand, if you haven't picked it up already, is the fact that this trip did not take me to the rainforest. In fact, it kept me many, many miles away from it. But we were in a savanna-like area known as the Cerrado. This is mainly the area that has been cleared for agriculture in parts of central and southern Brazil. Much of this land had become so overgrown with trees and brush that the farms are actually bringing some benefit by getting this overgrowth under control. However, the Brazilian government realizes that to properly protect the rainforest, they must also protect the Cerrado. And that's why they have a law that deals with percentages of land that is used for farming and what must be set aside for conservation.
I think one of the main areas that government is involved in is the environment. And there's a lot of different areas. It's pretty rigorous in terms of the protecting the environment in Brazil. The most well-known is what's called the Forest Code in Brazil, and that's basically you're setting aside a certain percent of the land that you own in reserve, and so it depends on where you're at. The further away from the Amazon, the lower that percent is. The closer you are to the Amazon, the higher that percent is. And so where I was at in Brazil and Bahia was still quite a ways away from the Amazon. I mean, probably close to 1,500 miles. And so even though we were 1,500 miles away, where we were at was not even considered a rainforest. It was called the Cerrado. And we still had to keep 20% of what we owned in a reserve or a set aside. You couldn't do anything with it. You couldn't raise cattle on it. You couldn't hunt on it. It was had to be registered as a vegetation preservation land. And so that's, every farmer does that everywhere. And so overall it's a fairly widely followed and practice in Brazil that everybody takes, the government and farmers take very seriously. Now, further north you get towards the Amazon, that percent increases. And so there's areas where it's the opposite, where it's 80%. And so if I own 1,000 acres, that means that 800 acres, potentially in the Mato Grosso or someplace a little bit closer to the Amazon, have to be in protected reserve. And so, one could actually argue that the farmers in Brazil are pretty much the largest owners of preserved, natural preserved area in the world, actually, because of that. And so you hear about these huge farms that have 50,000 acres or 100,000 acres that they're farming. Well, and that's true. That also means that those same people own tens of thousands of acres of naturally preserved property that they can't do anything with. And that's property that they had to buy. Now, maybe not the same rates is productive farmland, but it's still land that they have to buy and they have to maintain, and there's a cost to that. And so it's very different than the United States. Now, certainly there are bad apples that there are people that are not following those rules, and I think get a lot of the press a lot of times. And I think that the government needs to probably do a better job cracking down on those. But it's a challenge for them because the Amazon is a big place. It's the size of Europe, and so how do you properly police an area the size of Europe with no roads and no Wi-Fi and no cell signal and things like that? And so they actually have the satellite technology to monitor some of the illegal deforestation, but that ironically it's difficult for them to actually get boots on the ground to go stop some of that from happening, just because it's such a rough area.
It's an interesting time in the country as the current government has slowed the approval of more land clearing permits to almost a snail's pace. That means the farmers are in limbo as far as getting their farmland into production.
They want to see the location of the farm, if it's close to anything. If they want to see the type of vegetation, all that. Just lots of paperwork and bureaucracy, and it's gotten worse over time, I suppose, in that sense that 20, 30 years ago, they didn't have to go through all that. So it's become more difficult to even open land that you're allowed to open. It depends on how much you want to clear too, because if he's saying if it was less than 1,000 hectares, which would be 2,500 acres, if it was less than 2,500 acres, the process is a little bit quicker. I wouldn't call it fast, but it's quicker than what I'm told. But if it's beyond that, then it's a different type of request from the government that takes a long time.
And as we discuss the potential for more production areas versus a government that's slowing down permit approvals, you may be wondering how that will affect Brazil growing its production capacity. Matthew talked about that with our tour group on the bus.
We talked about where's all this growth going to come from. I think this is an example, right? I mean, it's already been cleared. It's just a matter of tilling it and putting all the lime and phosphate on it and planting that. So, maybe, I don't know if the owner's happy with cattle, or it takes a lot more money to plant crops on it, but I think we're going to see a lot of growth come from in the future.
But as we learned at the ethanol plant a few episodes ago, ag businesses and grain buyers aren't as willing to take the risk of getting in trouble with the government by doing business with farmers who aren't following the rules.
I think they're doing pretty well. I think that a lot of the banks have gotten involved because a lot of the shareholders of banks, so the international banks that loan money, want to make sure that the money being loaned out isn't being loaned out to people that are deforesting. And so I know that our Rabobank was an example. They involved pretty heavily in Brazil, and so their environmental oversight takes it pretty seriously. They want to make sure that they're not loaning money to anybody that's going to do something wrong with it or anything that would hurt the environment, because the last thing they want to be accused of is financing deforestation, right? And so I think the banks in general take it very seriously. So you got a lot of these stakeholders that are helping to enforce it, because there's a lot of outside pressure from the environmental community. I think grain trading companies, are doing more as well and take it pretty seriously. However, it can be hard, I would think, to source where all those soybeans are coming from a lot of times too. But there is a soybean moratorium that that's in place that they're trying to follow. It doesn't reduce the deforestation levels down to zero, unfortunately, but I think they have made some progress, and I think the new administration has been very vocal about wanting to reduce the deforestation, and is working, I think, pretty closely with a lot of the international environmental community on that.
So what about those trees we were seeing being cleared in the beginning of this episode? Well, they're being put through large chipping machines, and these chips are then used for fuel and drying systems or industrial systems that can't rely on natural gas for fire. Other chips will be used in landscaping and other related uses.
These trees aren't just pushed over, burnt, and left to rot. If the producers knock down the trees, they make sure that nothing goes to waste.
Well, that's been a quick peek into the environmental regulations and policies that affect the ag industry in the country of Brazil. Now, by no means am I saying it's a perfect system, but it's a good system that is getting the gaps closed, and people are working hard at the government level and in the private sector to make sure that everybody is doing right by the planet. Now, of course, there are bad actors, but we have them in the United States. In fact, there are bad actors with any policy all over the world. That's why regulations are put into place. Now, I can't believe that next week we're going to be looking at the final episode in this series. I hope you've enjoyed episode 9 in environmental regulations and learned something, maybe to dispel a few of the misconceptions that we often hear. I hope you'll join us again next week as we continue and conclude this series on my trip to Brazil. From the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, I'm Dustin Hoffmann.
Coming up next time, we wrap up the series as we talk to a few of the Iowa farmers that were on the trip to Brazil. We get their perspectives of the similarities and differences between Brazil and Iowa's agricultural operations. Join us next time here on the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network.